Hello, in this video I'll be talking a little bit about racial capitalism on the intellectual property protections resolution for the LD September-October resolution. It's been a little bit since we've done this series. The last time we talked about it, we were talking about how teams could better exercise their critiques of racial capitalism and the neg versus policy teams on this resolution. And I definitely think that racial capitalism will be one of the best arguments to make on this topic, because I feel like racial capitalism really represents the crux of what I think is like some of the best criticisms of the resolution as a whole, which is like, what does it really mean to think about like owning intellectual property, and like what does owning intellectual property mean beyond the like commodity of knowledge? How does that relate to like how people are represented, how we think about representations of certain populations, etc.? And I think that there are a lot of interesting ways that policy teams can respond to critiques of racial capitalism, not just because of the way in which there are obviously ways in which you can like respond via historical arguments about the nature of like how international politics operates as a whole. But I definitely think that the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, being kind of the locus of the mechanism for the resolution of the LD topic, means that there's a lot more like expansive ground in terms of like what you can do in terms of how you respond to the resolution. And I think that it gives a lot of really interesting ways for you to think about the way that you can think about intellectual property, but also the modes in which intellectual property can kind of be used as a way to think through how we actually like arm like marginalized countries, populations, etc. And I think that there's such a really interesting way to talk about the international from a policy perspective, in ways that I feel like a lot of alternatives can't really touch in the same way. And I think that if you're able to really frame that and have your priorities straight from the beginning, then you have a lot of like really good places to start from, and I think just a better understanding of like what you should be doing throughout the debate. But I think it kind of requires understanding where that timeline should go from the beginning in order for you to have a better idea of that, which is kind of like where I want to start this video now. When I'm thinking about what are like the priorities for how you want to answer something like racial capitalism on the intellectual property protections topic, I think that the best type of response that you can give probably starts from just thinking about the way in which the terms of racial capitalism can change when we think about it, not just as a domestic system to like common critiques of what is happening in the US, but as like a global system, and the way that different kind of like needs of populations are kind of created out of the scarcity that's created by organizations such as the WTO and other international organizations, but also the way in which like scarcity and other forms of like resource management and necessary like access to various resources can be accomplished through mechanisms such as the WTO. And I think that's a place where you really want to start a lot of the debate that you'll be having on this flow. I think that when you're really trying to figure out how you kind of want to use that as something against other teams, I think that a lot of the offense that you would want to generate from it are the kind of ways in which their one-dimensional analysis, the way in which the WTO can be used, basically kind of oversimplifies how complicated the international stage is, the way in which not teams, but rather countries and actors are always kind of constricted by a series of decisions that are outside of just like, the resolutional question of whether or not people should have access to a thing, and how those kind of like complicated history means that we need to have like a really in-depth conversation about like how we kind of like think about various vectors of resistance to these international systems. And I think that thinking about how countries can basically insert themselves politically internationally is definitely a really good place to have this conversation, because I think that it definitely allows you to win a lot of arguments about why certain state-based projects, or like government sovereignty-based projects that are created by thinking about things through the context of the WTO, are kind of necessary for the immediate resolution when we think about things like the vaccine crisis, when we think about things such as other types of like bare medicine necessities that are barred because of the way in which we think about intellectual property laws. And I think that being able to talk about that can allow you to have really unique perspectives against racial capitalism as a whole. I think that when you're specifically just talking about like how you should be doing the framing debate, I think a lot of the arguments that you want to make for how the judge frames the debate should not just be about like being able to value the plan and the way that we think about the plan in a vacuum, but rather I think that you should be making specific arguments about like how you can raise the bar for what type of like example work and necessary historical contextualization the other team needs. I feel like a lot of the best answers to racial capitalism won't stick to just talking about like how the US responds to the resolution, but will actively explore like other types of mechanisms and other ways that different countries kind of become involved politically with not just the US, but like the well-being of the world. And I think that there are so many linchpin economies that are connected to the WTO in interesting ways that I would definitely love to see explored on this resolution. And I think that the more that you kind of explore these nuanced kind of like explanations or nuanced situations in which the types of like frames for how we talk about colonialism, racism, etc. don't cleanly fit when you apply them to like other countries and stuff, that there are a lot of creative arguments you can really make in terms of how the proximate type of issues that are being created on a global scale can kind of only be resolved through the use of kind of pairing decolonial ethics with like this kind of like larger use of policy that I think is like really important. I think that the way that you can kind of like make this super offensive in terms of your framing argument when you're trying to figure out how that should turn into things like standards and other stuff like that, the types of arguments that I think you really want to be making is that the kind of like the question that this particular resolution weighs is how can we be more specific about the types of claims that we make about the international and the way that they apply to specific countries. And I feel like the arguments that you want to make in terms of education, fairness, the inability to mute the app are most effective when you use them in order to talk about how you kind of raise the threshold for the next, like link arguments, impact arguments, etc., and the way they're contextualizing these specific logics of their structural criticism to that of like the global stage and not just the US domestically. I feel like automatically kind of like forces them to tap into a different field of examples than I think a lot of teams are usually like able to like regularly refer to when they're making arguments like this. And so I feel like a lot of the best offense that you can make really comes from being able to win why the specific offense about how we talk about different mechanisms other than the international is important, and why like the inability to mute the 1AC based off of that is like super important as well. I think that when you're thinking about how you kind of change this into like the thesis debate or what you should be doing for the thesis debate in relationship to this, a lot of this advice that I would give like comes from applying directly some of the advice that I've been giving about framing into like how can you create and make your own narrative for how you're thinking about various types of histories that like lead up to this moment. So if you're making arguments about like how the negative threshold needs to raise in terms of how they're able to explain their link arguments and make them specific to the app, I think that the onus then becomes on you when you get to the thesis portion of the debate to really spin this story that explains why the history of like the particular place and political moment that you're talking about and the particular law that you're raising like as a result of that means that there's like always kind of this kind of difference in the way that we're thinking about things like marginalization, the creation of like capitalism as a particular value, and the way that that can be like coerced by other international actors. And I think that it definitely changes like how we think about like the responsibility of like who holds like the weight of kind of like international capitalism on like countries that aren't able to like basically predetermine their own economic system in a way that's really valuable, and how does that relate to the way in which we think about what types of policies we need in order to like dissemble that kind of system, and why that kind of requires like multi-layer process for how we address those things. I think starting there could be a good place to kind of like laying out some of the offense that you have for some of the other portions of the flow down when I continue to talk about in the next video. So as always, thanks you for watching, and hopefully you'll be here next time.